we were emerging from a time of very high sexual repression.
Mm-hmm.
So right before the sexual revolution, we were a very puritanical culture, and you just didn't talk about issues of sexuality, or even we used repression to deal with it.
Hey guys, I'm Ashley Dawn Rivard, and you are now Into the Dawn, a provocative podcast that looks at all things taboo, such as suicide, grief, sex, addictions, and more. Each week, I talk with experts who successfully investigate their areas of interest. And if you like what you hear, please remember to subscribe. Today, I'm talking with Father Brian Reedy. He's a priest in the Jesuit community and a chaplain in the U.S. Navy. We discuss the sexual abuse inside the Catholic Church and what is being done to correct that, while exploring guilt and shame and how it relates to religion, as well as diving into his role as a chaplain in the U.S. Navy and how they are working on healing the epidemic of vets committing suicide. So I just want to dive right in. What was the moment in your life when you knew you wanted to become a priest?
Well, it's a good question. It's a really complicated question. I didn't grow up Catholic, so to be a priest wasn't until much later in the story. But it's when I was 10 that I really realized I wanted to do something like for God, like something in my relationship to God. And then essentially I was at summer camp, had an experience where I felt like God was calling me to give my life to him in some way. I was 10, so I didn't know what that meant, but I had this strong, persistent feeling. And I hid from it for several days, like trying to just block it out of my mind. But it would always come back. And then finally, I just kind of in my head said yes to whatever that was. And I felt a very strong sense of peace and satisfaction with the idea. So I was flooded with peace and joy about this. When you become a Jesuit, you don't become a priest, because a Jesuit is a member of a religious order, and you could be a priest or not. And then after 12 years, you then are ordained a priest. So the 12-year process is for ordination. So for most of my Jesuit life, I was not a priest. I was not ordained. It's only in 2012 that I was ordained, and then so it's only for the past 7 years that I've been a priest.
When you're a Jesuit, do you have to take that oath of celibacy as well?
Yeah. So to begin the process, you take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So poverty, we don't own anything individually. So I don't own anything.
You don't own a car?
No, we have cars. So I don't own anything. We own things. So it's kind of communal property. So the Society of Jesus, we pay all of our, like my, so I work here at LMU as a professor of ethics, and I work in the philosophy department, and then I'm also a Navy chaplain, as we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But that pay gets paid in my community, not to me. And then
So you don't even get your own paycheck?
No, yeah, it's a common pot. We're essentially religious communitarians. So yeah, we share all of our resources.
How does that feel?
It's amazing.
That feels empowering?
Well, all the vows have a very freeing dimension and a limitation and a restriction. And you sometimes feel either. I don't have any, I don't own anything, but I also don't have any bills. So,
right.
Yeah, so it's nice.
Yeah, but
so
you feel taken care of.
And we have bills. So,
yeah.
At first, it's very much being taken care of, because while you're in formation, the society is meeting your needs.
Yeah.
But then as you mature through it, I mean, then you become one of the leaders, and then it's more like a family.
Right.
We're just like a really big family. There's 32 Jesuits here in the community, and we share everything together. So so we have a fleet of cars, and when you need one, you sign one out. We do also have an Uber account, so if we need to get around by Uber, we can. But again, that goes to the community. So and then our pay all goes to the community. So the poverty dimension is kind of non-ownership, individual ownership, and that we try to live as simply as possible, so that we can, with our surplus money, we can do something with it, give it away, give it to charity, or like in most of our institutions, we give it back to the institution. So historically speaking, here at LMU, the Jesuit community is one of the biggest benefactors, because we would give our surplus back to the university.
Oh.
Chastity,
so nice.
Meaning simply we can't get married. So that's the simple of it, is that we can't get married. So that means also that since we're not looking to get married, that we don't date or anything like that. So so we have to learn ways of, relate to people as chaste men. So it changes how
chaste men.
Yeah, chaste. Yeah, so in chastity, men who are chaste. So it's a different way of relating to people. It's one that takes a while to learn, but I'm sure we'll probably talk about that some more later. But so that's the basic of it. Is that one of the things that I found very interesting is that once you make a decision, it's like getting married. Once you make a decision that's that permanent to be chaste, a life of celibacy, you start growing and you start relating to people in a different way. There's a lot of freedom in it. Like at first, I would always get nervous around somebody that I found attractive and everything, and then all of a sudden I didn't, because I wasn't nervous anymore, because I wasn't looking.
There's nothing on the table.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, which does lead to a question I have. Do you feel by taking that oath of celibacy, you're repressing a natural biological desire?
Well, not repressing, no. But it is a natural, the desire to reproduce, the desire to have sex, the desire for a partner, the desire to have children, those are all very real and very natural desires. So celibate living means that you grow to have a deep understanding, self-awareness, and that you sublimate or redirect those kinds of energies in a healthy way.
So have you ever wanted that? And then you surpass that? Like when you would work on it, like redirecting the energies, then you kind of get to a level of where you acknowledge that it's been there, but you don't have that urge.
Which urge?
To have a family, to have sex, to do any of those things.
Right. So at first, it's a process. It gets something like being married. That at first you make a decision to get married, but then you actually have to emotionally recenter yourself into a relationship where you're actually depending on your spouse and everything, and you stop kind of scanning the horizon for something else. So similarly, there's a process involved, and at first it's very difficult. So like we for me personally, I was out in the middle of nowhere. Our novitiate, which is the first 2 years of formation, we were in a small town in Louisiana. So there was there weren't even any women around, hardly, except for 2 old nuns, and
they didn't do much for the eye.
No, sweet women, but but they and then after we take vows, I then moved to New York City. I was living in the Bronx and going to a university, and so all of a sudden there were all the possibilities I could imagine, right, and surrounded. And so at first it's very confusing and disturbing, because you haven't learned the new skills yet. You haven't rehabituated yourself. You haven't learned how to do celibate loving. It's easy to fall in love, or even worse, like can happen, is that you don't understand that you're responsible for other people's response to you. So people can start falling in love with you, and you don't necessarily deal with that the most responsible way. And so it's a process at first, and it's rocky at first.
How old were you when you took your oath?
I was 24. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a little personal, and you don't have to answer this, but had you had sex prior to that?
I had not. No.
Okay. So you didn't know what you were missing. Because
Because
that could maybe be worse.
Right. Yeah. That does for a lot of guys, because we're especially younger Jesuits are really pretty open and honest about all these kinds of things. And so with that, guys who have been sexually active before, and the more that you're sexually active before, the harder the decision can be, especially at first, of course.
I could imagine.
for those that haven't, it's just a lot easier. But as time goes on, that levels out in a lot of ways, because it really shifts. Like at first, it's about sex, and then it's about partnership, being somebody's most important person. So being the most important person for somebody out there. Where I will never be the most important person for anybody out there. But the thing is that what you learn is that I'm in the top 5 for a bunch of people. Right. So it's a trade-off. And one that can be very satisfying. Where I am now, it's more about children. So I see a lot of my friends all have kids, and some of my even, like I'm getting old enough that some of my students could be my kids, And I frequently had this, I want one of those kind of feeling. That doesn't go away.
Could you adopt? or no?
No. Although
Okay.
it's an interesting question, but like we could adopt, I guess.
What do
We
you
could
mean?
take like a community could take guardianship, but
Oh.
yeah. So,
Oh my God. They're like, I have all these dads.
yeah, exactly. Talk about modern family, right?
Right.
I have 32 dads.
Right. Which I kind of want to actually segue into a question about religion. I'm very passionate about understanding, basically from your view, how religion in the 21st century addresses the larger culture of guilt, shame, fear, and taboos in modern society.
Okay. Yeah. The one thing is that I'm not the best source for the famous kind of phenomenon of Catholic guilt, as it's called. There's a thing called Catholic guilt. And I'm not a good specialist in that because I've never understood it. And in fact, growing up as an evangelical Christian, I had a lot more of a sense of kind of this persistent guilt that I couldn't get rid of than I did once I became Catholic. Because with the dynamics of examination, in which you kind of examine your conscience and then you go to confession and you have an experience of reconciliation and forgiveness, like I actually found that it was a lot easier for me to overcome feelings of shame and guilt as a Catholic. But I don't know why that's not everyone's experience, but it's not. So I don't know why there's such a thing as called Catholic guilt, but I don't understand it. So you have to talk to somebody else about it because I don't understand the dynamic at all. I find that the psychological health of being able to examine yourself and find things that you're not happy about, and then to actually relieve that sense of tension by going and talking to somebody about it as deeply as you want to, with complete 100% confidentiality, and then hear them pronounce over you God's love and forgiveness. It's very potently
powerful for you.
Yeah, powerful.
Which leads me to asking you about this confession thing that, again, as you know, I'm not privy to the Catholicism, but speaking with people I know who are Catholic as well, tell me if this is wrong, any of these facts, but like somebody I was speaking with specifically, she was saying she had a lot of guilt because before she even like had a conscience, right? She was like 5 or 6 and she was told she was a sinner and she needed to go to confession to basically be deemed worthy. That's how she had felt. And so do you think that type of thing when you're told before, you even know who you are, that you're a sinner and you have to go confess, do you think that can cultivate a culture of guilt?
Yeah, I like I said, I'm not having not gone through that experience,
right.
But not as a practitioner, so as a priest who hears confessions for younger people.
Okay.
I don't see how what I do could do that, but I do see how, if done poorly, it could do that. So there's a sense of there could be an early sense of guilt and shame that before the person is even, like you said, before there's even development of a conscience.
Is that from the religion, though? That's what I'm confused. Does Catholicism say basically you're born a sinner and you have to go to confession?
No, Catholicism says that we are born with a fallen nature, so that we have a tendency to sin, and that is essentially a kind of we have to overcome our own egoism, and that learn to be focused on other people and to be generous and to be and to have a life of gratitude. That it takes work to become a free and loving human person, and that for whatever reason, that humans are things that we have a fallen nature. So we are inclined to do things that are wrong in some way, and that you have to learn how to overcome that. I have always, like, for instance, some parents I've seen, the way I've really seen this play out is that some parents will use confession and or the priest as a kind of disciplinary tool, where if the child is bad, they'll be like, well, you'll have to go see Father. You'll have to go to confession if you keep doing that. Well, that's actually a very strange dynamic. That's turning the confessional and the priest into if nothing else, just folding it into some kind of superego, as opposed to actually it being about reconciliation with God and reconciliation with an infinitely loving God. Because what the confession is supposed to be about is the human soul in whatever brokenness or sin that they commit has an infinitely loving God who welcomes them back. That's what the sacrament's supposed to be for. But that's not how it's always practiced. I mean, one is that it can grow this strong sense of guilt. And two is it can be used on the other side as a great license where you can do whatever you want and then you go to confession. So both of those are abuses of the sacrament. That's not how it's supposed to be on either way. But right. But evidence of human sinfulness is that we tend to abuse even really good things.
Very true, right?
We're sneaky creatures.
Everyone. Everyone. Yeah. It's so funny. So I kind of want to shift gears. What, in your opinion, were the core factors that conspired to bring so much sexual trauma inside the Catholic priesthood?
That's a really good question. So there's a lot of factors. One is that in the 60s and 70s, we went through the sexual revolution. It was just everything was in flux in the 60s and 70s, and in the United States and just around the world. And a lot of people left the priesthood. So a lot of religious, a lot of diocesan priests, a lot of monks and nuns left the church, left
because
religious
of
life. There was an excitement about a sense of about sexuality and just a kind of freedom.
Okay.
So individual freedom to do what you wanted. Yeah. Kind of a loss of faith and belief in institutions in general, and a suspicion of institutions, and then a triumph of the individual will. So people just would think, I want to do something different. And there was a lot of enthusiasm around that, and so a lot of people did. And so it led to a vocations kind of crisis almost immediately that I think that we just, had a kind of desperation, just in the same way that when you go to war, the entry qualifications and the vetting process for your soldiers goes down because you just need more bodies, And I think that in some ways, one thing is just that we had this strong need. We had these big institutions that needed men and women to lead them. And so we just kind of, in one way, lowered our standards. So that's one piece, is that we lowered our standards. Two, we were emerging from a time of very high sexual repression. So right before the sexual revolution, we were a very puritanical culture, and you just didn't talk about issues of sexuality, or even we used repression to deal with it. And once that lid came off, there was a lot of growth that happened, but at the same time, people just didn't know what motivated them. So people would, like very religious people would, like a lot of our situational abusers, had never really dealt with their sexuality. They never really explored their sexuality. If they had kind of, what would be, they never explored their sexuality. They didn't know where their sexual energy came from. They didn't know what it was.
They didn't go through your training then? They didn't go through that length?
No, they didn't, nothing like what we do now.
So would you say that a majority of those cases that come out in the news are from that generation?
Yes, the vast majority. Yeah. In fact, the frequency of abuse now is really, I mean, the abuse cases, even from that generation, are still below the national averages. So we're still doing well, just statistically speaking. We're doing pretty well. The problem for us is not so much that we have a higher frequency of abuse. It's the institutional protectionism. It's the tendency to protect ourselves. So because the church holds lots of money and has very deep pockets, and people go after that. And then also, there's a sense we have to defend what the people own. Right? So, and so there was this defensiveness that's really where the real serious problems came in, is that we had, the leadership was not capable of dealing with these things. A lot of the leadership still had the same repressive techniques. They didn't understand their own sexuality, so they're hiding from their own dynamics. And then you have these cases that they're dealing with. They just want them to go away, psychologically and financially, just want them to go away, which is a lot of pressure,
Totally.
Now, all institutions dealt with that for a while, but we just took longer to learn, and we were circling the wagons a lot more strongly. I think we're a lot better on all of those things, but I think those are some of the things, like before Vatican II, before the in the 50s and before the sexual revolution and the kind of major transformations in the church as well. It was people didn't talk about sexuality hardly at all. And so people didn't understand themselves. And if they did have an experience like something with homosexuality or something like that, they would understand it just as a sin and temptation that they could just kind of get rid of.
By going to confession?
No, just by essentially using repressive techniques.
Oh, by becoming a priest.
No, not necessarily, because it may be a priest, maybe not. But the priesthood could be a place you could hide from things like that.
Exactly.
Like if you had a complicated sexuality and you didn't want to deal with it, the priesthood, you might naturally gravitate over there without actually consciously ever making a choice about that. Because
then it comes out.
And then it comes out. And you don't even know why. Because people weren't dealing with their sexuality in a straightforward way. They weren't trying to understand themselves sexually. They weren't kind of recognizing the fluidity and complexity of human sexuality. And so they're pretending everything was neat and clean and then shocked when it wasn't.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas we've really, Jesuit formation now is really a pretty deep dive into our own psychology and spirituality and sexuality.
So you feel strongly that in the next, we'll say, generation or years to come, what we've been seeing will dissipate?
Oh, definitely. I also think that even right now, I would say that because we've taken really pretty profound action, I think that the church is probably one of the safer institutions, actually.
Okay.
Now, I don't want to sound triumphalistic or overly proud about that, but we've really taken a lot of action, and in a way that a lot of other institutions haven't, because other major institutions like public schools and sporting teams and such, I mean, they've the same kinds of things are happening there, so I think that we're moving much more quickly in a good direction, and I think that will definitely. I mean, we are interesting creatures, humans are, and like issues of things like pedophilia and abuse run in our populations. We don't really understand why, but they're human phenomena. It's not. We are getting better and better at understanding the phenomenon itself, and then ways to recognize problems and to identify them and then to address them. And so, as a church and as a society, I think we're getting better. I think that on all of these things, we'll be getting better. Certainly, what's very clear is even for the leadership who's still from a generation that it's still very taboo, still very difficult to talk about, and they still often don't even have the self-reflection to understand themselves, they know they can't cover it up. Like we've been smacked on the nose enough times that even if people don't have the self-awareness to be able to deal with these topics, they know they can't cover it up. Yeah. And so that's one thing that was very important for us to learn. And I think that we mostly have. There's still a few holdouts. Yeah. Like you still see every once in a while somebody circling the wagons, and you got to be kidding. We can't do that. Yeah. But
I kind of want to shift into, as we've talked about, or you and I chatted off, with the suicide rate of vets coming back. Is that something that is talked about in these institutions, in the military, in the Navy? Like, are they addressing it?
It's one of the highest priorities in all of the branches of the military. Like, for instance, the Air Force really took a stand-down day where they took a 24-hour period where they were mostly trying to tactically address what's happening with them and their suicide rates, because their rates continue to go up. Yeah. They're a little bit peculiar. Most of the other branches, the rates are kind of going down slightly, but the Air Force is still struggling, and so they're doing everything they can. Like everyone is doing everything they can. I would say the main thing that I do for the Navy is suicide prevention. So one is that I'm on 24/7 call for those 500 men and women, so they know they all have my. They're supposed to have my. So if you're hearing this and you don't have my number, my number is no. Yeah. So they're supposed to have my number in their cell phone, and when they need somebody to talk to, because the main thing is that we have, and this is pretty cool, we enjoy 100% confidentiality. So we are not a mandated reporter on anything.
Oh.
So by law. So we are protected in that a service member can come to us and talk about suicide, abuse, even child abuse, and we do not have to report them. The reason is...
But you can.
No.
Oh, you can.
No, the person owns the information. You cannot...
Wow.
So it's 100% confidential, and the service member owns the information. So I cannot share that information with anyone.
Okay.
on any of those issues. And the reason is we just recognized it was necessary because they had to have someone that they could talk to. They had to have someone that they could talk to and still own the information, and the last thing they need is to be in an extreme situation, have something like from their childhood or something else that comes up that involves abuse or something, and they have to just bottle it up and sit on it because they can't talk to anybody without having repercussions. So there has to be someone. Now, we're trained pretty extensively on that because for as a priest, it's not that unusual because that's like confession. Only confession is a lot stricter than confidentiality. Because in confession, I can neither share information nor can I act on any information.
Oh, okay.
Once they leave my confessional, I can't do anything. Whereas with confidentiality as a chaplain, I can still do something.
Okay.
Like I can physically intervene if they're going to tell me that they want to commit suicide and they're going to leave. I can stop them.
Okay.
Or if they say that they intend to kill somebody, I can just follow them.
If they say they're going to kill somebody and it's a homicide case, you can't report that?
No. It's 100% confidentiality. They have.
Ooh,
I know.
But how would you? You know what I mean?
But I can stop them. I can physically restrain them. But yeah, it's 100%. So the person in all protected communications with the chaplain. In other words, when the service member seeks the chaplain in their role as chaplain, then the service member owns the information.
Tell me again what you were saying regarding that. I believe you said the rate of suicide with the vets, it's not so much around PTSD, but it's called moral
injury.
Moral injury.
So the PTSD is essentially, after a trauma, there is a strong emotional, largely fear-based, the root emotion is usually fear, relationship that then has a whole set of kind of predictable, but a constellation of behaviors that arises from it. But moral injury is a different category. It's not currently recognized within the what's the document called? I never can remember
the suicide document.
No, the psychology book that has all the MRS.
I didn't take psychology.
Anyway, so there's a big book of disorders. So in the psychological big book of disorders,
we'll call it that.
Something for MS. Manual of, anyway.
Okay.
MSDS is the only thing that comes to mind, but we can look it up later.
Okay.
In that manual of disorders and such, there's no diagnosis currently for moral injury, but within the psychological community and within the chaplain corps, we recognize that there is a distinct phenomenon called moral injury. And that is when somebody has been forced in some way, either by circumstances or by some authority, to violate their conscience. So they do something that they believe is wrong. And it leaves them not feeling afraid, but instead guilty, and they feel ashamed. So the primary emotion is shame and not fear. A great example of this is drone pilots. So drone pilots, sit on a base thousands of miles away from action, and they fly a drone and they kill people, right? But they have no mortal feeling of their own, the mortal tickle, right? They're not under threat themselves. It's not self-defense. Normally in military actions, you have you can console yourself with dimensions of self-defense. You yourself were under threat.
Right.
You yourself were under mortal threat.
So you feel almost like a sense of validation of doing this.
You feel, whereas when you're under no threat and you're still taking lethal action, it can cause moral injury because you can't console yourself with the fact you can't understand your own behavior because you weren't defending yourself. And so the Air Force has taken several, they've tried to adjust how the system works to try to distance the person, like the shooter is different than the observer, et cetera. So they try to separate the different.
What does that mean?
The person who's flying a drone and surveilling the situation and gets to know the people
isn't the person taking the action
who takes the shot.
Got it.
So that so it's different teams, and they've tried to relieve the psychological tensions this way and such. So they're doing what they can, but in the end, it is a lethal action that you're taking, right? And you're not under mortal threat, and so you can't console yourself with the fact that that it is self-defense.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing is what is an example, or just in general, when you're if you're under fire and you respond with fire, and there are children present, and
Sure.
and accidentally they die, you don't mean to kill them, or there's there's oftentimes in war where children will be used intentionally as cover or to deliver weapons, and so then it becomes necessary actually to kill a child. And people often morally don't ever recover from that, obviously.
I
right?
would assume
Yeah,
not.
exactly. Right. So that's not PTSD. That's an entirely different phenomenon, because they can be conjoined.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that's tricky about moral injury is that institutionally speaking, moral injury admits guilt of some sort. In other words, if the Navy were to investigate, separate out moral injury from PTSD and start investigating it and diagnosing it, they would be admitting to some kind of fault. So if the definition is the psychological response that somebody experiences when they are by some standard required to violate their conscience or commit an action that by some standard is considered wrong, well, then there's a culpability issue from the institutional side. So that's why there's a lot of hesitancy on addressing this issue that's emerging.
What do you think as a priest are your most effective tools in helping people deal with guilt and shame or fear?
One is that a priest is supposed to be, like the reason that we spend all this time in school and the reason that we do all these different things, that a priest is supposed to be a specialist in human nature. A priest is supposed to understand how we tick really well. And we're given a lot of opportunities to grow in that, to understand essentially kind of practical psychology and how the human person works. And then therefore we can kind of help counsel people. So I think the main thing is compassion and empathy, a loving and unconditionally positive response to somebody who seeks help, and then we have at our disposal. So that primary just approach of being somebody who's knowledgeable about human nature, and compassionate is the first thing. But then we have a whole kind of bag of tricks. So tools that we can use, confession being the main one.
Okay.
Because in confession, it's essentially what you do is you go, kind of item by item and talk through what's happening with them. Like why, how do they understand what they did wrong? Why did they do it? Is this part of a pattern? Are there habits involved? So it's kind of what was motivating this.
Okay.
So you kind of analyze the actions in a way that helps them potentially kind of adjust what they're doing. So it's kind of a very practical counseling sort of thing, behaviorism sort of thing. And then you assign a penance, and the penance that I assign is always specifically related to the thing that really stood out that they did wrong. So I assign something that makes sense. In other words, it's a step in the direction they want to go. It's a step of rehabilitation. So
what's an example?
So somebody stole something from a store. Okay. One, by Catholic theology, they have to make restitution. So anyway around it, they have to give the thing back if they can, or something like it. So they have to fix the injustice they've done. That's just required. That's not a penance. But then two, we talk about why. Why did they take it? What motivated them? What is that something that they have done before, that they have a habit of some sort? Or what were the circumstances? Were they choosing something good? Was their daughter who they could not currently provide for in need of something or wanted something, and they, out of their love for them, they, so the context makes a huge difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
To understanding why.
Yeah.
And then the penance would be probably some act of generosity. So, or I would suggest, I often do mental things where I have them imagine something, just because you're trying to form a new habit. And so my penances always deal with rehabilitation. So it's taking us one step towards forming a new habit. And so that's what I have kind of at my disposal, and then, when absolution is words essentially where the person understands that God forgives them. And so that's I think psychologically pretty potent too.
Absolutely. So for those who are listening who have experienced guilt or shame around Catholic religion, in particular, what advice could you give them to bring them inner peace?
Well, it's interesting. Like the Jesuits have it's called Ignatian spirituality. It's a way of spirituality, and one of the things that is particularly potent in it is that it's not at all about shame or guilt. It's all about freedom and becoming a loving person. In fact, shame and guilt are a huge part of what holds you back. They are not helpful or they're only helpful in the early stages. I mean, they have to be outgrown. I mean, shame and guilt are dynamics of infancy and childhood.
But then why do so many, it's a common thing I hear, like the people just throw it around, like, I'm Catholic, I have guilt. I was born, I'm guilty. So I'm. Yeah, I like I said, I didn't grow up with that, so I don't really understand Catholic guilt very well. But I think. But you hear it.
I think that what happens is, so in like Piaget's developmental models, like you have earlier on, shame and guilt are part of what are psychologically used to help form a conscience. So in childhood, shame is something that helps you become socialized. It's one of the socialization dynamics. It helps you realize what your cultural and societal roles are and how you function within that. So it's one of the dynamics that dominates childhood in your conscience formation, your moral formation. But you're supposed to grow past that. That adult moral formation is not about shame and guilt, but about choosing what's good and right for its own sake. I think that maybe a lot of the dynamics of the church have at different times just been very infantilizing. So people, like ministers or just practitioners in general just weren't operating out of that higher kind of moral standard and just maintained a kind of simplistic and infantile set of moral principles, and therefore people felt stuck in shame and guilt as opposed to arriving at higher levels of moral formation.
Okay.
Now, I think the whole set are present in the church. But I think that at different times there are different times in different places. There are different levels of health.
Okay, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
Similar to the idea of masculinity, right? So in some the church, like the billion people, have all kinds of different views on masculinity, on the role of gender and that kind of stuff. But some places there can set up a dominant set that's really unhealthy. And so similarly, I think that the way that you understand guilt, I mean, the Christian religion is largely about understanding yourself as free from fear of sin and death. That's what the central theme of Easter and the cross is. Is it's supposed to be that humans are radically free from sin and death. There was no reason to be afraid and no reason to feel shame and guilt. And yet that's not what people often experience in it. So I would say that if that has been or is your experience, my source of hope would be, there's so much more. That there is real true freedom and a true sense of moving past it.
Awesome. Well, to wrap this up, I have a very off the cuff question I was thinking of when we were talking about what you can and can't do. So you can't have sex. Can you drink?
Oh, yes.
So you guys can go get hammered and that's okay.
Well, not get hammered, but
I mean, is there you know what I mean? Is there like, you can have this many beers, or is there rules, or alcohol in general is okay?
Well, so we are committed to lives of virtue. So alcohol can certainly form a part of a virtuous life. But we'd be governed by the same thing. So we understand it in Catholic theology. It's understood that drinking to excess, drinking to the point that it's damaging to you, it would be considered sinful. So we couldn't get hammered. But yeah, we can
just sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, we can certainly party. We can have a good time.
That's so
but
funny.
Drinking to the point that you were no longer in use of your rational faculty and would make bad decisions, that would be dangerous. So that wouldn't be smart. But yeah, we definitely. Alcohol's a healthy part of our life.
Okay. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today and enlightening me in Catholicism.
It's been my pleasure.
And I wish you all the best in all your endeavors you have going on. That's it for today's podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. Please let me know what you think. Leave a comment, share, and we'll be back next week with a new episode.